Hey, welcome back to the show. We've got a couple of stories to cover. We're going to start with the massive scandal that's currently going on in Minnesota, where Somalis have stolen billions from Minnesota taxpayers. The double tap controversy continues to linger, and we'll take a look at the latest from Venezuela. So let's go ahead and start with the first story, which is the fact that billions of dollars have been stolen from Minnesota's taxpayers. A lot of that money has been alleged to be sent back to terrorist organizations like Al-Shabaab in Somalia. Listen to White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt describe exactly what happened here.
According to a new bombshell report from the New York Times, Somalian migrants in Minnesota have defrauded nearly $1 billion in taxpayer-funded benefits under Democrat Governor Walz's leadership. A nonprofit and its affiliates with these Somali migrants claim to have fed tens of thousands of American children during the pandemic. They were reimbursed for those meals by taxpayers. However, federal prosecutors found that almost all of those meals were never even delivered to hungry children. In fact, those organizations' leaders spent the money on houses, luxury cars, and real estate in Turkey and Kenya.
So I'm sure this is infuriating a lot of people. You're probably asking yourself, how the hell can this happen? How can billions of dollars be stolen from American taxpayers and sent overseas to support a terrorist organization? And how is it possible that no one noticed while this was happening? Well, whistleblowers did notice it. Unfortunately, they were targeted. Take a listen.
Tim Walz systematically retaliated against whistleblowers using monitoring, threats, repression, and did his best to discredit fraud reports. So Walz had a COVID snitch line, but when someone snitched on the Somalis, he hung up the phone. This should have been the biggest story of the election. Kamala's VP pick let his state get fleeced. Walz even gave one of the Somalis a trophy before she was arrested, the Outstanding Refugee Award.
So while this whole thing was happening, Governor Tim Walz was handing Outstanding Refugee Awards to some of the same people that were fleecing the people of Minnesota. This is unbelievable. But this is just the beginning. Take a listen.
How bad was this scam?
Well, it's even worse than the current reports indicate. It's not just a single billion, but sources in Minnesota tell me it's multiple billions of dollars that have been stolen by Somali migrants, predominantly in Minneapolis. They were doing things like faking autism diagnoses, faking autism treatment plans, opening up fraudulent autism centers, and then bilking hundreds of millions of dollars from taxpayers. This is the biggest systematic fraud scandal, and it's not just a few isolated individuals. I think we're looking at hundreds of Somali families and really widespread recognition within the Somali community.
So the report started with 1 billion, then it went to 2 billion. Now they're saying that it's up to 8 billion or even more than that have been stolen from Minnesota's taxpayers. Remember, I showed you in a previous video how it is alleged that a lot of those billions of dollars went to support Al-Shabaab in Somalia. You know, I know there are a lot of reports out there that say, well, you can't target the Somalis. It's not all of them. It's just a few. The problem with that statement is that the facts are working against them. There was a study that was conducted by the University of Minnesota of 166 first-generation American Somali families. About 65% of them are still on some type of social assistance. The majority of Somalis in this country depend on government welfare systems and programs to sustain themselves on a daily basis. So when you hear people say, well, they don't contribute a net positive to this country, that's fact. So you can't judge people for criticizing and stating fact. However, when these types of scams happen, somebody's got to take responsibility. It trickles down to the bottom, but ultimately the responsibility is at the top. And at the top is Tim Walz. So let's listen to him take responsibility for what happened.
Do you take responsibility for failing to stop this fraud in your state?
Well, certainly I take responsibility for putting people in jail. Governors don't get to just talk theoretically. We have to solve problems. And I will note, it's not just Somalis. Minnesota is a generous state. Minnesota is a prosperous state, a well-run state. We're AAA bond rated, but that attracts criminals. Those people are going to jail. We're doing everything we can. But to demonize an entire community on the actions of a few, it's lazy.
In other words, he's saying that he's not taking responsibility for anything that happened. And that is unfortunate because it starts with him. If the governor is going to say that Minnesota is a giving state, is a generous state, it is his responsibility to ensure that there are safeguards in place. Americans pay taxes, not so they can be stolen and sent overseas to support terrorist organizations. They pay tax dollars to support communities, to support local welfare programs, and to support the people that actually need it, not to be scammed by a select number of people. I don't think Tim Walz should be the only one held accountable. I think the congressional member who is in charge of the district where most of the fraud took place, should also be accountable. That's why I was so interested to hear what Ilhan Omar had to say, since most of the people that were captured and were incriminated based on what they did in this scandal were in her district. Let's listen to what she had to say.
Can you shed any light on why the fraud got so out of control in Minnesota?
I think what happened is that, when you have these kind of new programs that are designed to help people, you're oftentimes relying on third parties to be able to facilitate. And I just think that a lot of the COVID programs that were set up, they were set up so quickly that a lot of the guardrails did not get created.
Now, I don't know about you guys, but she sounds a little bit nervous to me. There is no way that this massive scandal was taking place. She is an integral part of the Somali community there and knew nothing about it. This whole situation seems fishy to me, and I'm really curious on what we're going to find out in the future once this whole investigation takes place. However, you heard when Tim Walz was asked, do you take any responsibility? His answer was, I take responsibility for putting people in jail. That's about it. Now that this massive scandal is blowing up, and it has made international headlines, now he's changing his tune when it comes to enforcing the law to ensure that this doesn't happen again. Listen to what he had to say.
My message is simple on this. You commit fraud in Minnesota, you're going to prison. I don't care what color you are, what religion you are. Anybody who wants to help us in that, we welcome that. But sitting on the sidelines and throwing out accusations, and let's be very clear, demonizing an entire population and lying to people about the safety and security of this state, is beneath that.
Now, there's two parts to his statement. The first one, he's talking about people reporting the fraud. Everybody should come forward and report the fraud. They tried that the first time and it didn't work. As a matter of fact, the whistleblowers that came up were threatened. And the second part of his statement has to do with the increased presence of ICE in Minnesota after this whole massive scandal and the president's comments about Somalis. Take a listen.
And they contribute nothing. The welfare is like 88%. They contribute nothing. I don't want them in our country, I'll be honest with you. Okay? Somebody say, oh, that's not politically correct. I don't care. I don't want them in our country. Their country's no good for a reason. Their country stinks, and we don't want them in our country. I could say that about other countries, too.
I think I probably would have expressed that just a little bit different. But I think we all know how President Trump is at this point. He was not talking about the Somalis being garbage. He was talking about the country itself. And that doesn't necessarily include the people in it. And the reason I say that is because Somalia is an absolute disaster. Somalia continues to struggle with internal conflict. The terrorist organization Al-Shabaab remains active and is responsible for numerous terrorist attacks in the country. And that includes bombings, raids, assassinations, especially around the capital, Mogadishu. Now take a look at this report from before, and I can tell you right now the situation has only gotten worse.
A 2017 report on poverty by the United Nations Development Programme indicates that about 73% of people in Somalia live in poverty. According to the report, the civil war fueled by Al-Shabaab militants has worsened the poverty indices in Somalia.
Remember what I told you previously in this video, Al-Shabaab remains a tremendous player within Somalia. That is why this whole scandal is so big. It is reported that a lot of that money went to Al-Shabaab, who continues to contribute to the instability of Somalia. So in other words, the tax dollars that came from Minnesota contributed directly to the instability of the country. But you know the media was going to run away with the garbage comment. So let's listen to what CNN had to say about the whole garbage incident.
The Twin Cities are home to the nation's largest population of people from the East African country. The president's rhetoric and actions are being called xenophobic, racist. It's also a complete contrast from how the president felt about Somalis when he needed their votes.
Minnesota is home to a large Somali population, which has historically voted Democrat. But we're hearing more and more. There are many reports about them supporting your candidacy this time around. But why should they?
Because they want safety. They want security. In many ways, they have the worst crime numbers in terms of crimes against. And they want to be safe. They want security just like everybody else. And I've heard that. I've heard I'm doing very well in that community.
Now, let me ask you a question. If this scandal would have happened during the presidential election, what do you think President Trump would have been saying? Do you really think he would have been saying anything different? Maybe he would have toned it down a little bit, but he still would have been saying the same thing. We've got to go after these people. We've got to go after illegal immigration, and we've got to stop the fraud that's happening in this country. But we all know what always happens, right? Anytime anybody says anything about a specific group of people, it's always racist. That is the driving force behind anything that anybody in the Republican Party says. Take a listen.
Do you agree with me that the media does this kind of conflation intentionally when the president is talking about groups of immigrants whose behavior he doesn't approve of? It tries to turn this into a conversation about race.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that is done regularly, not just with Donald Trump, but with Republicans in general. That typically is the label that is placed whenever there is any sort of criticism. Now, I do agree. Now, I don't think that the comments that Donald Trump made, well, first of all, it wasn't true about Haitians eating dogs and cats, but I don't think that that was necessarily racist. And I don't, even in this case, I think that Donald Trump, you know, it's built in the cake that Donald Trump probably will say a bit of inappropriate things.
The label that's attached to you if you support this administration is that you're a racist, you're a Nazi. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. That same reason is why this whole scandal in Minnesota was allowed to blow up. Take a listen.
And what's so amazing is that when the fraudsters were almost investigated by the Department of Education, they literally threatened to call them racist if they didn't allow these fraudulent programs to persist. They use that sort of woke logic that terrifies white progressives in order to keep stealing.
Yeah, and this is something, again, that is done over and over again. It is not just with the Somali community. You think of and I would say that the Democratic Party just over the years, the reason that they've been one of the reasons they've been so successful in really garnering a large portion of the minority vote is because they play these sort of racial politics. So again, any criticism for any reason is labeled as racism or xenophobia or things like that.
So this takes us to our next story, which is the double tap scandal. Here we are again addressing the issue that Admiral Bradley ordered a second strike on the 2 drug runners who were stranded at sea. The latest thing that the Democrats and the left-wing media is sticking to is the fact that Admiral Bradley consulted with a judge, a lawyer, right before the second strike. Take a listen.
So that September 2nd strike, our reporting now is that the Admiral Bradley told lawmakers that he consulted with a military lawyer, a JAG officer, as they were watching this video before the second strike was made. Is that SOP, is that standard operating procedure, or does that suggest they knew that something could go terribly wrong?
Look, one thing to say here at the outset about JAGs, we've seen from the very beginning of this administration, one of the very first things that the Secretary of Defense did was to fire some of the most respected and trusted senior JAGs at the Pentagon. JAGs play an incredibly important role. I asked this question of Admiral Halsey when he came before the House Armed Services Committee earlier this year. Lawyers play an incredibly important role in our military and in advising and ensuring that our military reflects who we are as a nation, but also it goes to the core of military strategy. The law of war is designed with our values and our interests in mind. And so
now this whole interview is a word salad. The simple answer to that question, to her initial question, is yes. Military lawyers are consulted before every strike. I told you when I was in Afghanistan and we controlled the airspace, before the kill chain even started, the lawyer was consulted. We asked, is this a legal strike, yes or no? If the judge advocate, or the lawyer says no, we don't strike. There has to be legality to every action that we take, or there will be repercussions. It's not that the admiral thought that something could go terribly wrong. It's the fact that he was following protocol. The simple answer to her question is yes. A lawyer is always consulted before we execute any strike. But the Democrats are going to continue to speak out against the second strike. Take a listen.
Senator Cotton said that this was a lawful attack that was carried out. In your view, and from seeing the videos here, was this a lawful attack?
I think the video was very disturbing. I am not going to weigh in on all of the questions about lawful, morality, judgments, until I get all the information. I mean, some of the accusations that have been made, whether this kind of action constituted a war crime, I can't think of a more serious accusation that could be made And anyone, and I'm just saying, at least for this senator, I'm not going to make a judgment on that until I have all the information.
So Senator Warner didn't necessarily disagree with what was happening. It didn't sound like he was disagreeing. Disagreeing sounds like this. I just came out of that brief. Atrocious. This is egregious. We cannot continue to do this. I have to get with my fellow Democrats and we have to stop the atrocities that are taking place. That is not what you guys saw happen. He didn't even know how to answer the question. Now, he did mention Senator Tom Cotton. So let's see what Senator Cotton had to say about the whole thing and how he saw the strike.
Of course, before our military conducts such a strike, they have multiple sources of intelligence that give high confidence that everyone on that boat is a foreign drug trafficker, not an innocent civilian who's being human trafficked, for instance. And therefore, Secretary Hegseth said, and I agree, they're all valid targets. Now, this controversy, let's remember, all started with a Washington Post story about 9 days ago that said after the first strike, there were 2 survivors that were helpless, and then they were ordered to kill these helpless survivors. That is simply not the case. They were not floating in the ocean on a wooden plank or in life jackets. They were on the capsized vessel. They were not incapacitated in any way. It was entirely appropriate to strike the boat again to make sure that its cargo was destroyed. It is in no way violation of the law of war. And I think the Washington Post owes Secretary Hegseth and especially Admiral Mitch Bradley, a highly decorated career Navy SEAL, an apology for that slander.
The people on this boat are drug traffickers. Not people being smuggled, not people being trafficked. These are drug runners. Now, one of the things that is not played in the media is the fact that this has happened before. We have struck a boat and we've had 2 people who are truly shipwrecked, swimming for their lives. The boat is capsized, it is destroyed, and people are swimming for their lives. What do? We rescued them and took them to shore. And I think that's a very important part. Once again, the reason why 70% of Americans are against anything going on with Venezuela is because we're not providing them the information that they need so they can make an informed decision on whether they support these moves or not. How many times have you heard this report that there were 2 capsized individuals stranded in the ocean that we rescued?
That is in contrast, for instance, to another strike that Secretary Hegseth described just yesterday in October, in which you had 2 survivors who were in that state. They were essentially just dog paddling in the water. And what happened on that strike? A U.S. vessel went and picked those survivors up and took them back to their home country. That's just an example of how our military makes these decisions based on the facts and circumstances of each particular case, consistent with laws and with the directive you just stated.
This is probably the first time most of you heard it, and it shouldn't be. Another thing that the left-wing media is sticking to now is intelligence stating that that boat wasn't necessarily headed to the United States. It may have been heading to Europe as its final destination. And I'll counter with this. Who cares where it's going? It's full of drugs. Does it matter if it's going to kill kids in Europe or in the United States? Why should we let it go to Europe? But let's listen to the report and see what they said.
We're learning additional details about what Admiral Bradley told lawmakers in those briefings and what they might have seen in the video. CNN reports that the admiral said the alleged drug traffickers killed in the September 2nd strike were heading to link up with another larger vessel that was bound for Suriname. That's according to 2 sources with direct knowledge of his remarks. MS Now has not independently confirmed that report.
Once again, who cares where that boat is headed? The fact is that that boat is loaded with drugs and needs to be eliminated. A lot of people continue to say, why aren't we just interdicting these boats? We've done that in the past, and has it worked? We've done it for decades, and it hasn't worked. Since we started these operations, since we started blowing up these boats, 91% reduction in drugs coming into the United States through waterways. This is the most effective method that we have to prevent that poison from coming into this country. And that leads us to our next story, which is Venezuela. President Trump continues to state that land strikes are coming. Listen.
Very soon we're going to start doing it on land, too. If we have to, we'll attack on land also. We will hit them very hard when they come in by land. We're going to start doing those strikes on land, too. You know, the land is much easier. It's much easier.
You know, I think once these strikes start on the land, the opposition force is going to be the primary force. I don't think the United States is going to engage in combat operations. As much as those Marines want to do that are on those boats, it's not going to happen. We have the opposition to fight the battle. This is their country. They need to take it back. And I think Maria Corina Machado has that 100-day plan in place for a reason. And I think it's going to work. Is it going to be costly for us as Americans? Yes, absolutely. The munitions are very expensive. But the Venezuelan people have to be the ones that take back their country. And they will. I think Maria Corina Machado has a great plan in place to ensure that that transition of power happens. Now, one thing that I continue to hear politicians do, which is ridiculous, not just politicians, I hear military strategists doing it as well, is the comparison between what's happening in Venezuela now and the actions that we're taking, comparing that to Afghanistan and Iraq. And the commentary is always the same. Well, haven't we learned from those previous wars? Let me tell you, it is not the same. Completely different. We're talking about two Muslim nations compared to a secular Christian nation. A Christian nation, Venezuela, that had democratic elections. The issue last year was that those elections were stolen by the Maduro regime. That is the reason why he is not the legitimate president of the country. An overwhelming majority of Venezuelans voted him out. So this is not going to be the same thing as Iraq or Afghanistan. We are not going to engage in a prolonged war in Venezuela. It's not going to happen. And the politicians that continue to make the comparison sound completely idiotic. But here's one of them.
I don't know what the president's going to do. I'll tell you, there is no way on earth we should be going to war or trying to do regime change in Venezuela. I'm not a fan of Maduro, but the idea that all you got to do is remove someone and something better automatically comes in its place, I would trust that Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, a whole lot of places would have taught us that lesson by now, and that we would be out of the regime change business.
Well, there it is. The dreaded comparison. Venezuela is another Afghanistan and Iraq. We'll probably be there for 10 years. We'll be there for a decade trying to fight the insurgency. It's not going to happen. Once again, we're talking about a Christian, secular country who has had democratic elections, right? They were rigged last year, but the elections occurred against Muslim nations who are extremely conservative and have completely different values. The comparison is ridiculous and people need to stop making it. One of the things I want to debunk is the lack of information that's being provided to the politicians. There are a lot of politicians out there stating that the Trump administration is not giving them the information that they need in order to make the right decisions, right? Whether to determine if the strikes are legal, if they're illegal, and whether any type of military action should be taking place in Venezuela. That is completely false. The information is there for whoever wants it. Take a listen.
Are you getting pretty much the information you want to get about the Venezuelan operations? I mean, you may not be getting them while the operations are going on, of course. But if you inquire about something, are you able to get pretty much the information that you want?
Yes. So over the Thanksgiving holiday, I was down in a number of places in the Caribbean getting information on this, meeting with service members that were down there conducting operations, of which I had many positive things to say about what it is that they had to say. For any member of the House of Representatives, if they want to go travel down to Florida and go to Southcom and get a brief about the operations that are going on there directly from Southcom, they could have that take place. There are a myriad of options for members of the House to go out there and get information.
Every elected official has the security clearance that they need to sit in on any of these operations. All they have to do is call wherever these operations are taking place. In this instance, it's Southcom, and say, I want to sit in a couple of these operations. They have the security clearance to do that. When it comes to Maduro, I think he's just trying to sit this one out. I think he understands that 70% of Americans don't want anything to happen in Venezuela. And I think he's banking on that, just staying put and waiting to see what happens. I know that the Cubans have a lot of influence on whether he goes or he stays, but I think he's just waiting it out. They just swore in another 5,600 into their military. Take a look.
Venezuela tiene una fuerza armada junto al pueblo, fusionada, adiestrada, entrenada, moralizada. Por ninguna circunstancia permitiremos la invasión de un imperio. Si la patria nos necesita, si la patria demanda nuestras vidas, denos la orden y saldremos en este instante a defenderla.
Maduro and his cronies continue to think that they have a chance against the United States. But for Americans who are wondering, how tough is this fight going to be against Venezuela? Let's take a look at a comparison between our military and theirs and the assets that we have compared to theirs.
The US ranks third worldwide in active personnel, backed by the largest defense budget on Earth, a colossal $895 billion. Venezuela's entire defense budget, just $4.1 billion. The difference is not a gap, it's a canyon. Look at air power. The United States has nearly 13,000 aircraft. Venezuela has just 229. What about fighter jets? US has more than 1,700. Venezuela, just 30. Helicopters? US stands at 5,800. And Venezuela is at only 88. And when you shift to the sea, the comparison only grows sharper. The United States has 11 aircraft carriers, floating cities of firepower. Venezuela has none. Its navy counts 1 frigate, a single symbol of blue water capability. Ironically, Venezuela does hold an edge in patrol vessels, useful for coastal defense.
Maduro continues to hold rallies all over the country, trying to convince the Venezuelan people that the imperialist nation of the United States is there to completely take over the country and steal their oil. Yes, I already told you that oil is part of the reason that we're there, but that is not entirely the reason that we're there. We're there to free the Venezuelan people. Remember, over 8 million Venezuelans have left the country to come to the United States because of how bad the conditions are there. But Maduro continues his no war, yes peace stance.
No crazy war, no. Listen to me. War! War, no! Never, never war! Tú no tienes nada.
You know, for Americans that see these videos, I think they look at him, they say, well, how harmful is he? He doesn't look like such a bad guy. He has killed thousands of people. He has jailed thousands of people. So he may seem like a nice guy, but he is not. If he were, people wouldn't be fleeing Venezuela the way that they are. Take a look.
Since 2015, Venezuelans have fled to over 90 countries to escape the economic collapse. Between 2015 and 2017, Venezuelan immigration increased by 1,388% in Chile, 1,132% in Colombia, 1,016% in Peru, 922% in Brazil, 344% in Argentina and Ecuador, 268% in Panama, 225% in Uruguay, 104% in Mexico, 38% in Costa Rica, 26% in Spain, and 14% in the United States.
All right, make sure you guys leave your comments below. I know there have been hundreds of comments when it comes to Venezuela, when it comes to the double tap. Continue to leave those in the comment section. I'm responding to everyone. Like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, stay balanced.